Step 4, record significant findings and action necessary. Now, once you've completed the fire risk assessment note sheets, and we went around there, identify the observations and actions necessary, and you've made all your observations, then you start assessing the risk to the occupants. And this is an example of the type of sheet you'll need, this one here. First one there shows you significant hazards. The next one shows you the people or groups at risk. Then it shows you your size of risk. You've got to determine now, it's a qualitative risk assessment, high, medium or low. Then you need to put in your measures in place to prevent fire and or reduce the fire risks. And that includes measures to reduce fire spread, give warning and ensure the safe evacuation of people. And finally, further actions needed. So this is where you make your recommendations. Let's have an example. Go down here, significant hazard, you find the staff aren't trained to use fire equipment in line with the wording on the fire action notice. Who's at risk? All staff. Size of risk, this person is identified as being low risk. Measures in place, well, fire action notices are sited around the premises, staff trained in evacuation process. Further actions needed, the management are to decide on a policy to be adopted, select and train the staff accordingly, and amend working on notices to implement the policy. In other words, give this, and that this person here is given it 6 months. Next hazard that someone identified was there's no evidence of regular audits. Who's at risk? In this case, all staff. Again, size of risk, low. Someone could have argued it's medium or high. The person who did this one decided it was low risk. Measures in place. Fire alarm system, you've got fire extinguishers, emergency lighting. It is being maintained by a third-party company with records available, so everything is being done. You find out, you check your records, the audits, not necessarily been carried out, but the things are being done. What you've got to do, develop and implement a fire audit system with checks undertaken and recorded on a monthly basis. And you're going to give yourself 3 months to set that system up. Another one, you find an evening shift is now being worked by a telesales department on the 4th floor, but there's no emergency lighting installed in the building at all. Well, now who's at risk? Well, in this case, it's your evening staff. Size of risk, someone's determined that to be medium. What's the measures in place? Well, there's no rooms without natural or borrowed light, but insufficient late at night time. So at daytime it's okay, but at night time it's a problem. What are you going to do? Further actions. Install emergency escape lighting to the 4th floor and the stairwell. Give it 3 months. Consider torches as a temporary measure until installed. Another example from a risk assessment. Significant hazard, large quantities of stock in the corridors which could cause major damage and fire spread and impede the means of escape. Who's at risk? All persons. Size of risk? High. First of all, measures in place. Now, the cleaners are employed, but they're not carrying out the cleaning correctly. Detection is provided in areas with sounders if there is a fire, and the linings are non-combustible, so they won't promote it. What have you got to do immediately? Remove all stock as a fire spread, but it's also a trip hazard. So that's something that can be done immediately. In summary, once you've completed your forms, your risk assessment, you finally make a summary of your findings and give an overall assessment. So you'll fill these in once you've done your risk assessment, which is what we're going to go through on the course. You make an overall summary. The risk of fire occurring, is it high, medium or low? The risk of fire spreading, is it high, medium or low? And your justifications. And your risk to your persons, high, medium or low. And then, finally, you can express to the client in a manner that they understand, overall, the risk in this area is high, medium or low. So you've got to assess those 3 things. The risk of fire occurring, is it high, medium or low? Risk of fire spread, risk to persons, and give your risk assessment an overall risk. And then with this information, the client can at least feel confident that any actions required are justified based on the risk. So if you say it's a really low risk building and I recommend spending £300,000 on a sprinkler system and full emergency lighting and full day, you're thinking, well, you just think it's low risk. Where's that come from? Now, let's look at what these levels should be. There's an example of what is a high risk, medium risk. A high risk is a premises which will be deemed to be high risk if a fire could readily start and spread quickly through the building. It may have poor levels of compartmentation and separation, and the means of escape could be affected before people have the opportunity to leave the building. The premises may be classified as high risk due to the nature of its contents, which may be highly flammable or in large quantities with poor levels of management and bad housekeeping. And it may also be the presence of people with various disability that results in the premises being high risk. That's the reason, the type of people. Or in premises with a sleeping risk with inadequate detection. They're the areas where you would consider that building's high risk. A premises may be deemed to be medium risk, where a fire could start readily but will be quickly detected in order for the occupants to escape quickly. In these premises, the means of escape will always be available and should not be affected by fire prior to evacuation. And in a medium risk premises, there will be flammable materials, but not in large quantities, and they will be stored correctly both inside and outside where applicable. What about low risk? When do you classify a building as low risk? Well, low-risk premises are premises which will generally have low occupancy levels with people with no disabilities. The ignition sources are limited and therefore the likelihood of fire is low. And if there was a fire, there would be little chance of it spreading, so it's likely that the occupants would escape quickly. Now, by expressing the risk to the client in this way, again, they can at least appreciate where they should be focusing their efforts and which premises need attention. So if you do 3 fire risk assessments and you say these 2 are low and that's high, then the client understands that's the building they need to be spending the money on. To conclude this module, a fire risk assessment is an important step in protecting workers and businesses as well as complying with the law. It also helps to focus on the risks that really matter in the workplace, the ones with the potential to cause real harm. The law does not expect all risks to be eliminated, but employers are required to protect people as far as reasonably practicable. Again, what's a risk assessment? Well, don't forget, it's a careful examination of what in your work could cause harm to people so that you can weigh up whether or not you've taken enough precautions or you should do more to prevent harm. And workers and others have a right to be protected from harm caused by failure to take reasonable control measures. All places of employment are legally required to assess the risks in the workplace so that plans can be put in place to control those risks. Step 5, action plans to control the risks. Now, your outcome of your fire risk assessment is there to produce action plans to implement improvements. And this provides a clear list of actions required and timescales, and make the timescales reasonable. And this helps organise your resources and direct effort. It must include who is to carry out the improvement. So make sure you put down on the improvement who's going to do it, and are they aware they've got to do it. Now, your prioritisation based on risk. Once improvement measures required as a result of doing your fire risk assessment have been highlighted, you have to prioritise these actions. Now, to do this, you'll decide the level of risk. And as it was discussed in the early model, you can use this table. With a low likelihood, low consequence, you've got low risk. Then you look at the actions required for low risk. Now, the actions required here are, well, in case low risk, there's no further action required. The risk has been acceptable. It's an acceptable level. With a high likelihood and a low consequence, you get a moderate risk. Then you look at the actions required for moderate risk. Well, in here, the actions are, measures must be taken to reduce the risk. Carry these measures out in a reasonable time. Put in temporary, relevant measures to ensure that no one is at risk. One more example, with a high likelihood and a high consequence, prohibition, look at the actions required, quite clearly, you do not occupy this area until the risk has been reduced. Now, there's a clear distinction between your prioritisation and your timescales. Your significant risks are your high priority ones. You've got to develop realistic timescales. While some carry high priority due to their significance, the remedies may take a significant time to implement, for use. In other words, you might have no alarm system in. You can't just put an alarm system in tomorrow. It's going to take some time. But you've got to put temporary measures in. But that's what I'm saying. Sometimes it's not always that clear. Often possible to reduce some quickly. Remove it out of the corridor. Switch it off. Isolate it. But give the rest a realistic timescale. The general control hierarchy. What is the general control hierarchy that all risk assessors should be looking at? First of all, elimination. Get rid of the material or substance. Reduce. You can reduce its frequency or you can substitute it. Reduce. Isolation. Isolate the hazard from the workplace by use of, for example, fire-resistant storage. You've got control, and this is control at source. You might have fumes, dust. Totally extract them, get some local exhaust ventilation to remove the risk at source. And then PPE, anti-static clothing, conductive operator footwear, special clothing. But don't forget, these are the lower down in the control hierarchy. You've got to try and get it up first, higher up. And finally, discipline, which is follow rules, obey the signs of instruction, making sure people are doing it. That is the general control hierarchy. Review of fire risk assessments. Now in this module I want to discuss reviewing fire risk assessments. So when should you review a fire risk assessment? Well, you might have an incident such as a near miss or a fire. Incidents by third party. Another hotel's had a fire, you're a hotel, well how did that happen? Incidents by third party. You've got changes are proposed or made to a work process, activity or substance. There's three there. Any changes are proposed or made. Changes are proposed or made to the workplace because now you're affecting your means of escape. If you're changing the layout of the workplace, you might have changes to the number of type of people. For example, you might bring in young people in. You might bring people with disabilities in. You might get a guy working in the building now in a wheelchair. Have we done a PEEP for them, an evacuation plan? So changes to the number or type of people. You've got updates to building regulations. Now, when building regulations change, it doesn't mean that you have to comply with that building regulation. However, building regulations and guidance documents to building regulations are retrospective, whereas the fire risk assessment is retrospective. If they identify that this type of building's been identified as unsafe, you can't say, my building's been built 20 years ago, I don't have to comply. Well, not necessarily, you don't have to comply with building regulations, but the risk assessment is retrospective and you should demonstrate that your level of building meets the level that building regulations require.